Hi class. We're now going to read Walt Whitman, and that is no easy feat to accomplish. One of the things you need to understand about him is that his poem, Song of Myself, was revised over the course of his lifetime. It is over 1,000 lines long. We are reading only selected portions of it. One of the things we'll do is focus mainly on this poem. We'll read a couple of other ones, but in general, I'm going to try to get you enough biographical information so you can understand some of his themes, some of his techniques, and some of his lifelong goals. I celebrate myself in what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. If not a major theme, then indeed part of one. The idea of him reaching out to his reading public, his effort to embrace diversity, his effort to respect both his body and his soul, and to break down any kind of antipathy or opposition between the two. So, how to get into this behemoth, actually, of a literary figure. It's almost too much. You'll note that this particular presentation has actually originally 37 slides, and there's no way that I want this presentation to go that long, so I'm going to talk fairly rapidly and move pretty quickly. All right, here we go. So basically, you should know that he emerged as a poet in 1855 with a self-published Leaves of Grass. Even so, it's difficult to begin in the middle of his life, but that's really when he became a poet. And his origins are basically New York. His mother was a Quaker, and his father a very big fan of anything American. So his family was an interesting group. You'll notice the names: Andrew Jackson, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. Again, the particular political celebration there is obvious. Unfortunately, many were not as successful as Whitman. One was mentally handicapped. One died of advanced venereal disease, and one married an alcoholic. On the other hand, one was a hailed veteran and responsible for laying the St. Louis water system. So this is a quotation for an overview of this particular gentleman's biographical background. So I won't necessarily read it to you, other than just to note what I've already said, that he was one of the first generation of Americans who grew up in a family, particularly with a father who was proud of America. In 1823, his family moved to Brooklyn. He attended public school, but he was largely self-educated. One of the interesting biographical memories that he writes about is Lafayette's visit to Brooklyn on July 4th. Lafayette, of course, was the general who was friendly towards the United States, and his allegiance to the United States and his role in the French Revolution made him a very important political, historic figure. And of course, that excited Whitman, whose father was such a fan of everything American. In the 1840s, Whitman hadn't yet come to the fore with his poem, Leaves of Grass. However, during this decade, he prepared himself by being engaged in the several of a lifetime diversity of careers, with, of course, an emphasis on print. He was a journalist, he was a teacher, and, of course, he ran into trouble because he was always different. He was always rebellious. And he was fired from a particular newspaper, the Eagle, for support of free soil. He, of course, was an anti-slavery law or proposal. Of course, to admit no more free states, no more slave states into the Union. The publication of the poem Blood Money says it all. Blood money of olden time, when it came to pass that the beautiful God Jesus should finish his work on earth, then went Judas and sold the divine youth and took pay for his body. And of course, this was read as having a parallel to that of slavery, buying and selling slaves. Here we have poets of the slaves and masters. I am the poet of the body, and I am the poet of the soul, and I go with the slaves of the earth equally with the masters, and I will stand between the masters and the slaves, entering into both, so that both will understand me alike. Again, this introduces another one of Whitman's themes, and that is the idea of inclusion. He wants to include the many in the one, e pluribus unum. He stood by that theme. So you're going to see in his poems a long list of items, and he emphasizes that cataloging, that listing, by beginning lines of poetry with the same words. In the 1850s, of course, we had the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Not too long after that, we had the publication of Leaves of Grass. Whitman on the Fugitive Slave Law. Whitman has often been criticized for his comments on the Fugitive Slave Law, since he argued that runaway slaves should be returned to their owners, yet he was outraged by the law itself. Whitman wrote editorials such as the following: "Must runaway slaves be delivered back? They must. Many things may have the go-by, but good faith shall never have the go-by." Now, why is this significant? Because you would think that he, being an avid abolitionist in some ways, this is a surprising position for him to have taken, but it makes perfect sense. He was a patriot. He was a fan of the United States. He was a fan of the Union, and he wanted to stick by its laws even when he didn't agree with them. And there he is as a younger man. I suppose middle age would be more accurate. Preface to the Leaves of Grass. This is a very interesting statement, again showing his patriotism. "The Americans of all nations at any time upon the earth have probably the fullest poetical nature. The United States themselves are essentially the greatest poem." More from the preface. Again, this is his aesthetic beliefs. "The art of art, the glory of expression, and the sunshine of the light of letters is simplicity. Nothing is better than simplicity. What I tell for precisely what it is." So this should sound much like Thoreau. Song of Myself was the first of 12 untitled poems that followed the preface in Leaves of Grass. The first version I've already mentioned spans over 1,300 lines. Now, one of the criticisms and understandings of Whitman's studies is that in his later years, since he revised his poems frequently throughout his life, he toned down some of the radical nature, aesthetic decisions and themes and tones that he used in his earlier poetry. Altogether, there were 6 editions of Leaves of Grass. Basically, everything he ever wrote made it into Leaves of Grass. And here is a picture of the first page, one of the draft of the first pages. Well, in addition to themes of the many and the one, we have themes of sensuality. And this is a particular passage from section 24 in Song of Myself. Walt Whitman, an American, one of the roughs, a cosmos, disorderly, fleshly, and sensual, eating, drinking, and breeding. No sentimentalist, no stander above men and women or apart from them, no more modest than immodest. Again, there's all of this, supposed contrast and antipathy in his pairings, right? But in fact, it's as if by repeating enough opposites, he could somehow deconstruct that opposition or bring them together. An assault on literary decorum? Well, Thoreau is quoted, of course, as saying, "It is as if the beast spoke," reading Whitman's poetry. "I find it the most extraordinary piece of wit and wisdom that American has yet contributed." And there begins Emerson's patronage, which in some ways Whitman stole. Well, how did he steal it? He published a letter as part of his preface endorsing Song of Myself. This letter was written by Emerson, and he did it without Emerson's permission, and that sort of upset Emerson. The other thing that happened during his lifetime was the fact that, of course, he did bring some problems along in his wake. He was fired from a government post. He was controversial. Of course, his sexual orientation was controversial. Recently, some critics of American literature have argued that most politicians were ignorant of what Whitman actually wrote in his poetry. So it wasn't so much that his poetry was controversial as his very person. William Douglas O'Connor, a government clerk and longtime friend of Whitman's, wrote a pamphlet to defend him, calling him the good gray poet. He was, of course, the author of When Lilacs Last at the Dooryard Bloomed, one of the greatest elegies of President Lincoln. And there he is as the good gray poet. O'Connor is also credited with the anecdote of how President Lincoln, having seen Whitman walk by the White House, inquired who he was and then commented, "Well, he looks like a man." And to further the undeniable mythos, O'Connor told of Henry David Thoreau, who after a conversation with Whitman exclaimed, "He is democracy." There he is again in that famous self-portrait. Here we go. Themes of divinity. Well, in addition to themes of sensuality, we have, of course, what it is to be divine. Divine am I inside and out, and I make holy whatever I touch or am touched from. The scent of these armpits is aroma finer than prayer. This head is more than churches or Bibles or creeds. So you could say that he wasn't exactly orthodox. And also, again, you see him trying to undo the oppositions and to make whole and holy the natural and the organic. In the 1860s, another edition of Leaves of Grass was published. But what's remarkable about this decade, of course, is the outbreak of the Civil War. With the publication of Beat, Beat Drums, Whitman found a new purpose. This particular poem was to recruit people to war. It was tasteful and, of course, effective. But, of course, for those who he saw who needed to fight for the Union cause. In 1862, however, when his brother George was supposedly wounded, and luckily he wasn't wounded seriously, Whitman went to Washington to be close to him and to visit him in the hospital. His encounter with his brother and others at the hospital gave him a new calling. It wasn't a profession per se, but during most of the war, he frequently visited hospitals and tried to cheer up the wounded. When Walt Whitman arrived in Washington for the Union cause, he would sit by the wounded and soothe them or silently watch the dead. His visits to Washington's hospitals were well received by some and reviled by others. The books published in 1605, Drum Taps and sequel to Drum Taps, were both collection of his war poetry. In fact, it contained Beat, Beat Drums, Reconciliation, and Dirge for Two Veterans. These three poems were set to music in Ralph Vaughan Williams' famous choral piece, Dona Nobis Pacem. Also, its sequel included When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed. It was considered, of course, Whitman's last greatest poem. And while we're talking about Whitman's wartime poetry, let's rest for a moment on this particular elegy. I'm not sure if you've read it before. It is a lovely poem, and it is fairly accessible. It is, of course, an occasional poem written as an elegy. When lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed, and the great star early drooped in the western sky in the night, I mourned, and yet shall mourn with ever-returning spring. There are basically three major symbols in this particular poem, and they're very obvious. And of course, this poem is in some ways organized around the chanting of, or the repetition of, these three symbols. Lilacs, for instance, represent eternity. And the great star that early drooped in the western sky represents the fall of Lincoln. The third symbol, the solitary thrush, the solitary singer, represents, of course, Whitman himself. One of the reasons why this poem hasn't had a big impact on my students in the past, and it would always make me curious, was simply this. Lilacs do not grow in Southern California, and you can see, in fact, where lilacs bloom. And by the way, this is probably, I don't understand in some ways this map. It says cloned lilac range, which implies that these lilacs weren't somehow, indigenous, but I believe that this is the case for any lilacs, not just cloned ones. And by the way, and of course, here's a picture of a thrush. Here's the next slide. Solitary the thrush. What I find interesting about this particular symbol is that this song is one of the most beautiful in the bird kingdom. In 1865, Whitman was now famous. His image of the good gray poet stems partly because, and this is interesting, his retrospective introduction of wartime emotions into the great poetry written before 1860. So, in some ways, some scholars argue that he went back to his earlier poems and took and toned down, as I said, but also inserted some of the press, shall we say, and themes and interests that he received throughout the years, the wartime years. Yeah, that's an interesting idea. Perhaps he was a bit of a celebrity hound. In his later years, his last years, he suffered a stroke which left him paralyzed for the rest of his life. And and you have to understand that he was, of course, better known internationally than he was at home. 1881 marked the final edition of Leaves of Grass. So where does he stand? He remains central to American literature, despite the occasional nature of his wartime poetry. Remember, this wartime poetry was only downgraded because of its lack of, it was more of occasional poetry, and it wasn't as original and fresh and new as his early stuff. You've heard this kind of evaluations of certain poets and artists. Oh, his early stuff was so much better before he became commercial. Anyway, so basically, his place in American literature, without Whitman, we wouldn't have free verse. So in some ways, he's probably one of the most important writers aesthetically and artistically in our class. I certainly hope that by reading some of his poetry, you can get just a little bit of taste, a little bit of appreciation for him. The Columbus of our literature, he had set out for India and discovered the new world of himself in the old world of experience. Song of Myself, the central poem, and indeed the heart of Leaves of Grass, dramatizes this quest for the, quote, supreme fiction of the self. And of course, here is a better articulation of the one in the many, the theme, the one in the many. Oneself I sing, a simple separate person, yet utter the word democratic, the word en masse. And here is, of course, a little bit of archival photography. You can see the repetition. No Homer, Shakespeare, Voltaire. And I can't read the rest of it. Sorry, you guys. But anyway, you can see, you get the idea. I can read the three no's in a row. And here is my work cited, and I will see you in class.